Welcome to our February webinar. Our topic for today is the future of teacher education, and we are delighted to have with us Michael Feuer, the Dean of the School of Education at George Washington University, as well as by tape, Linda Darling-Hammond and Ken Zeichner discussing their recent research projects on the future of teacher education. Michael will then introduce our second panel with Ingrid Gogolin, Lim Ban Ching from Singapore, and Lynn Gangone from the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. So at this time, we'd like to start our session with the tape from Linda Darling-Hammond and Ken Zeichner, moderated by Michael Foyer. The FWE is an organization that was started about 2 years ago to bring together educators with the business community and other thought leaders to discuss how we need to transform our educational system to better prepare young people for the 21st century. The pandemic has given us an opportunity to do that, and we believe that this is a time when we should be considering additional and different approaches to the education of young people so that they are truly prepared to live in a world that many of us elders will not live to see. So at this point, I would like to turn to our first panel with Michael Foyer, moderating with Linda Darling-Hammond and Ken Zeichner. Thank you.
Hello to all of our viewers and listeners. My name is Michael Foyer. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And it is a great pleasure and honor to be able to moderate a conversation with two wonderful, distinguished colleagues and friends, Ken Zeichner from the University of Washington and Linda Darling-Hammond, who I believe still is associated with Stanford University and of course the Learning Policy Institute. And what we're going to be talking about today is some ongoing work and some new work having to do with the evaluation of teacher preparation. If you're wondering why the evaluation of teacher preparation might be something of significance to American educators and worldwide educators and policymakers, the logic is really quite straightforward. We know that teaching counts. We know that teaching matters. Many of us knew that for a long time, and then empirical evidence verified and amplified the message. We also know that we have, in most countries, wishes that our education system were doing even better than they might be doing. And by that, I mean both in terms of average performance and in terms of the reduction of inequalities in educational opportunity and educational outcomes. And when you put those things together, you end up realizing how teachers interact with students is really a very critical factor, and therefore how we prepare teachers for their role in the classroom and as mentors, educators, coaches, instructors really does matter a lot. And then the question becomes, to the extent that we want to provide evidence of the quality of teacher preparation programs, how might we go about doing that systematically, methodologically, and in a way that actually contributes to the improvement of practice? Both of my dear colleagues here, Ken and Linda, have been thinking about and working on this for many, many years. And they are currently involved in a new study under the auspices of the National Academy of Education, which is an attempt actually to revive and to renew a very serious and rich conversation about how we go about evaluating teacher preparation. It builds off of an Academy report that came out in 2013, I believe, or possibly 2015, about 2013, about evaluating teacher preparation, which just late last year was essentially turned into a very handsome website on the National Academy of Education site. And I encourage our listeners and viewers to look at all of that. And so today we're going to hear a little bit about the new study, and then we're going to have a conversation about what some of the issues are and see what we can learn and see what we can do to promote ongoing global cooperation, collaboration, and mutual learning. So once again, thank you very much in advance to Ken Zeichner and Linda Darling-Hammond. And we'll start with some opening remarks from Professor Zeichner. All yours.
All right, thank you. Good morning. I think it's whatever it is there, morning or afternoon or evening, I'm not sure. Our project, which Michael mentioned, is conducted under the auspices of the National Academy of Education in the United States, builds on the work of the 2013 report. Michael was the chair of the committee that produced that report. And we're building on it and doing some things a little bit differently, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. One of the principles that was proposed in the 2013 report was that evaluation of teacher preparation programs should lead to program improvement and ideally ongoing program improvement. We've taken that principle and it's been incorporated into our charge for this project, which focuses on program evaluation that leads to program improvement. That's what we're trying to emphasize. The goal of our project is to produce and to disseminate to policymakers, practitioners, an accessible consensus report. So it's not something we're just writing for academic scholars, but we want to make accessible to the field, people who actually conduct evaluation and program accreditation, and to provide clear and updated information since 2013 to teacher educators and their evaluators and to state and national policymakers more generally about the strengths, limitations, and the consequences of different approaches and methods of evaluating teacher preparation programs, to provide research-based guidance for for choosing, implementing, and evaluating different approaches, and methods to evaluate the evaluators, ongoing sort of self-reflection about the processes of the evaluation. We're interested in evaluation that places equity at the center. Equity with regard to who is involved, how it's conducted, and examining the impact of the evaluation on the teaching profession, equity in the teaching profession, and on teaching and learning in US schools. Our focus is on the United States, but as Linda will talk about in a few minutes, we're also revisiting again, because Michael's committee also did this in 2013, tried to look at what's been learned internationally about teacher education, program evaluation, accreditation. One of the elements of our project is to examine and analyze teacher preparation, program evaluation, and improvement in relation to the larger systems in which they exist. For example, we've commissioned an examination of the policies that currently exist in all 50 states for evaluating teacher preparation programs. In the United States, that's where the power lies with regard to education at the state level. And so through the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, they're conducting this analysis that we're going to discuss at our next meeting. about what policies exist, how consistent are they across different kinds of programs, and a number of other issues. We're also examining the standards and practices of the various national and non-governmental organizations that conduct accreditation and program evaluation. There are at least 3 major ones that exist right now, and there may be more that we may discover as we proceed through this project. And very little is known both about the state policies and how the states differ from one another and how these non-governmental organizations differ. To initiate the project, we conducted a series of stakeholder interviews with leaders in teacher education, in the teaching profession, policymakers, and various representatives from various state and national groups involved in evaluation. So those are basically the goals. We've had a few meetings, all of them remotely so far, understandably. So we have a lot to learn, but one of the things that we've learned, both from being in the field for many years and also through what we've discussed and read so far, is that there's wide variation in program approval processes, both across states and accreditation bodies, and how they approach it and conduct it. There are various issues that we're going to address as we proceed through this. For example, one of them is concerned with the issue of, if we're concerned about program improvement, we can't just look at the evaluation. We have to sort of look at the context of that impinges on it. For one example, very quickly, clinical teacher education is one of the universally recognized important elements of teacher preparation programs. And so there are a lot of standards that exist about what makes a high quality clinical experience. We have to look at the investment that's being made beyond the policies themselves to produce the conditions within programs that enable them to actually achieve those policies. Because there's been a history in this country of a lot of policies and standards being put out, and at the same time, the programs lacking the capacity to actually reach those standards in a genuine way. Another one that I'm particularly interested in, and I suspect the committee will be also, is accountability for whom? To ask some fundamental questions about program evaluation and improvement. For instance, in the history of teacher education in the United States, there has been at various times a concern with local communities, particularly non-dominant communities that are highly impacted by poverty, and where is their place both in the public schools in the United States in relationship to teacher education programs. I began my career in teacher education in a program, the Teacher Corps, that had decided that local communities needed to be at the table when policies and standards were being developed to evaluate schools and teaching within those schools, as well as teacher education programs. But largely, it's sort of moved into less of a democratic process, as I've observed it in the United States. And so we want to consider basic fundamental underlying questions like that as we deliberate and investigate the policy. So I'll turn it over to Linda. I've said more than 5 minutes already, I think, but I'll be quiet.
Thank you very much, Ken. What a terrific introduction and overview. And all I can say is it's a small academy, but with obviously a pretty big agenda. So Linda, your thoughts on what this is about?
Well, I'm going to pick up and build on what Ken already said. I think a key element of what he's articulated is the importance of thinking about evaluating teacher education programs in relation to the contexts and conditions in which they operate, right? And in the United States, as Ken already alluded to, we experience enormous inequality in the resources for schools, in the resources for teacher education programs, and the resources for teachers. And so on the one hand, we want to raise teacher education to a uniformly high level of quality as a clinical profession. And that is, as Ken said, one of the key things that around the world, teacher education programs are seeking to develop the capacity to be clinical practice professions, support systems, if you will. Some places like Finland, years and years ago, decades ago, made the decision to create a common uniform approach that, the 2-year master's degree on top of the undergraduate degree that has partner schools, model schools attached to every university. These are funded by the government. They're regularly available to all candidates. Candidates are go to school for free, so they don't have to decide how much preparation they can afford to get. There's a common standard for preparation that is commonly funded and resourced and invested in with professional practice schools attached to the university training in a way that enables the question about teacher education evaluation to be one of continuous improvement to meet the sciences of learning and development that we are always advancing, but not a question of can we even approach the kind of preparation that candidates deserve and students need for the candidates to have. So those policy conditions that enable a system or an enterprise of preparation are critically important around the world. And Finland is one place, as Singapore is another, where you could expect to go to preparation for free with a salary or a stipend while you're training. There's a kind of a common expectation for what that is. And the task of teacher education evaluation is to see how well people feel prepared to teach and how well they experience how capable they are of meeting the needs of diverse learners, and then to improve within it. In the United States, we have a more complicated job because we have these very disparate contexts for teacher education. We have very disparate contexts for schools. We have disparate contexts for the teaching profession. You can earn $30,000 as an incoming teacher in one state, $50,000 in another state, disparate across communities. And we have very little support in most states to enable people to afford to engage in high quality teacher preparation. And so as we look at the programs themselves and what they're able to do for candidates, how well they're able to structure strong clinical practice, as well as a knowledge base, access to a knowledge base that is important to continually revise that in response to what we're learning about the social, emotional, and academic development of students, the needs of diverse learners, culturally responsive practice, all of these things that teacher education understands that it needs to advance to incorporate. We also need to think about what's the context within which they're operating and how do we improve that context as well. And that's really the big policy question. There's one set of policies around improving programs internally in how they operate, who they can attract, who they can bring in. There's a lot of attention to diversifying the teacher workforce, but there has to be equal attention to the context within which they're doing their work so that people are supported to be able to access that kind of training, so that the context of teaching itself supports the recruitment and retention and high quality training of individuals in the profession. So I think as we look at countries around the world and look at preparation programs, we will learn also about the contexts for preparation that also have lessons for us as we think about evaluating the enterprise of teacher education, as well as particular programs in the United States.
Thank you, Linda. You've both emphasized an aspect of this whole topic, which has to do with the inequalities that exist, certainly in the United States. I suspect other countries are struggling with economic inequality and other forms of inequality as they affect educational opportunity. But in our context, it is perhaps, at least for those of us who have studied it, one of the most vexing constraints on our efforts to promote progress for all students. It's with sadness that I will quote a giant in our field who we lost just last week, Richard Elmore of Harvard University, formerly of Michigan State. I always remember that Dick once spoke about this problem and said, if you happen to be flying across the United States and God forbid you fall out of the plane, there's a good chance you might land in one of the best schools in the world, and also a pretty good chance you might land in one of the worst. And frequently they're a mile apart. And I was reminded of this as you were talking about the contexts of developing evaluation methods for teacher preparation in a society which has so much diffusion of responsibility, of governance, and of shall we say, the demography of who's teaching and who's learning and all the rest. So let me ask you then a more specific question about all of this contextual variance. One of the things that we have in the US is not just variance and kind of decentralized approach to education, but also with respect to teacher education and teacher preparation. What do we know about the quality of teacher preparation, perhaps generally in the US? But then if you would care to comment on what we think we know about the differences in teacher preparation between institutions of higher education, colleges and universities, where a lot of it takes place, and some of these, shall we say, non-traditional challengers that have arisen, which have very different kinds of styles and philosophies of what it means to prepare educators. Either one of you can take a stab at that.
Do you want to start, Ken?
You have to unmute yourself, Ken.
All right. Teacher education in the United States is, as we've been suggesting, highly varied in terms of the different kinds of programs, who sponsors them. Traditionally in the United States, that's the way it's been historically. A lot of different groups preparing teachers in high schools, normal schools, and so forth. But at some point it moved into higher education in the universities, where between about 1930 and 1960, approximately, universities essentially did all the teacher preparation in the United States. And recently, over the last few decades, we've come into a situation where there are a variety of providers, in some cases, as Michael suggested, challenging university teacher preparation to improve and become better. And so we have university programs, non-university programs that call themselves colleges of education, even though they're not connected to any institution of higher education. And then most recently, we've had a form of hybrid programs where school districts, which have historically been involved in teacher preparation, partner with universities, with charter schools in the United States, partner with neighborhood, local community organizations. There are several programs where the community initiated joining in a partnership with a program at a university. And so we have a lot of different kinds of programs, and the quality within each of those kinds varies hugely. In fact, the researchers who have looked at it argue that the variation within program types is actually greater than the variation across program types. And so we have some very wonderful programs in the universities. We have wonderful programs in some of the non-university programs and hybrid programs, but we also have some really horrible programs within those categories. So it's really a very wide-ranging situation. And then we have also teacher shortages. And so there are several states in the United States that have passed laws that enable exemption from teacher preparation because of there aren't enough teachers to teach physics or mathematics or in certain communities. And so the reality is a huge mess in a sense. Yet we have these standards and programs, university programs are accredited, and there's a single set of standards that everybody is supposedly meeting, but the reality is, I think, much more complex. And so I'll let Linda jump in here and say something.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that Ken said. And just to kind of frame the issues that determine whether you have high quality or low quality programs. When teacher education left normal schools and came into universities in the 1950s, the big problem was that universities didn't know what to do with teacher education. It's a clinical profession. You need to learn how to do things that are complicated. So what ended up happening was lots of courses were invented. Professors taught those courses, many of whom had never themselves been teachers in elementary or secondary schools. The complaint or the caricature of teacher education in that era was that, there were a lot of disconnected theoretical courses that were not well translated into practice. There was a dollop of student teaching added to the end of that undergraduate program, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it might be. And it was disconnected from the theory. Nothing was integrated in a coherent way. We do know there's been actually lots and lots of research on teacher education. Some of it was summarized in an earlier panel of the National Academy of Education in a book called Preparing Teachers for a Changing World, What Teachers Should Learn and Be Able to Do. And the key elements of a high quality program that were suggested by the research that had been done to date to that point, and then in the research that's been done since, some of which Ken and I have had the opportunity to work on together, are the same ones that you see being emphasized and sought in programs around the world. So there's the fact that it has to be coherent, that the practices you want to teach should be modeled in the courses in the university and in the clinical sites that teachers are in, that those things should be happening in some conjoined way, that teachers, when they're seeing what the practices are from expert practitioners and learning the theory behind those practices, are learning in a more powerful way that allows them to develop sort of roots on their own practice and the capacity to meet the needs of students, that there is an emphasis on child development and learning and how children grow and learn, as well as on methods of teaching in content areas which matter, et cetera. You can kind of go through these features. And they are the features that, inspired the reforms that I mentioned earlier in Finland, inspired the ongoing work in the National Institute of Education in Singapore, and inspired the Holmes Group of Education Deans in the 1980s, who created a model, a 5-year teacher education model, with clinical practice in professional development schools selected and nurtured to exemplify the practices that we know from research are those that are most likely to help children learn. Even today, having done more recent research in the field, many of the programs that you find that really do instantiate these practices in the United States evolved from that effort years ago. So there's not much of a mystery about what's needed in teacher education. it turns out that some universities have been able to secure the resources to do that and to continue to do it and to do it well and to improve it. There are also some places like High Graduate School of Education, which is a charter school enterprise that does project-based learning that has created a now accredited graduate school of education to do residency training of teachers who are learning to do that practice. And you would see great similarities between what they're doing and what you might see at Bank Street College of Education. So the sector is not the issue. It's the degree to which the practices that we know matter are put in place and are resourced, invested in, and supported. Not everybody can afford to do that because we don't fund teacher education adequately in most states of the United States. And candidates can't always afford to engage in it because we don't fund them with scholarships or subsidies to be able to take time away from their other jobs or their need to make a living and eat and have rent to do that. And so there is variability. The variability is predictable and could be easily reduced through some of the more broad policy reforms that actually affect the profession of teaching. The salaries that cause the shortages, the subsidies that allow people to get prepared, the investments that allow programs to do the right thing.
What we've been talking about so far is largely about the variability of teacher education. I want to get back to the question about, given all of that contextual variability and all of the contextual complexity in what it means to prepare future educators, professionals, about the evaluation of these programs, which serves various kinds of potential purposes or uses. And you've mentioned them. Program improvement, I believe, is again kind of at the top of your list as you're doing this new project. You also mentioned the word accountability. So just for the sake of getting into that part of the conversation, is it possible to imagine a methodology for the evaluation of teacher preparation that can serve program improvement, given all of that contextual variation, and at the same time provide something like the kind of evidence that we think we use to, to sustain some sense of accountability that we are doing good by the American taxpayer, and for that matter, educators and children and their families everywhere. What do we know about the fragility or the robustness of evaluation methods to withstand the pressure to be used for different purposes at the same time?
Do you want me to dive in on that one, Ken?
Why don't you start on that one?
I think we've got a lot of evidence that when we use tools for forms of accountability that have a theory of action behind them that says that we will shame or punish places that have poor data, that their utility for improvement is, often undermined. That actually is not the only way to think about accountability. It is the way that in the United States, term accountability has been appropriated in recent decades. If we were to think about accountability as programs being accountable to provide the best possible preparation needed by the consumers, the candidates who experience the preparation, and the people they will teach, the children for whom accountable teacher education is most important, right? then the question would not be how do we get indicators to rank programs against each other and punish some, which was actually part of a teacher evaluation strategy, that was proposed within the last decade. But it would be around how do we understand what features of the program need to improve in order to educate the teachers who are there, not for the purpose of ranking, but for the purpose of enabling them to do the job and to meet the needs of the children. So what would that mean? It would mean that we would be, again, looking at indicators of how well people are prepared to do particular things, to teach, the content that they're licensed to teach, to do that in ways that are responsive to the differential needs of different learners, to do that in ways that meet a vision of education for what should be provided in classrooms, in elementary and secondary classrooms, including one that takes care of social and emotional and academic and cognitive development, et cetera. And the ways in which we do accreditation and other kinds of program improvement would have to evolve to, reflect these capacities more productively. One way that people are thinking about this now is through both employer surveys about candidates that they hire, through surveys of graduates themselves about whether they had the opportunity to learn the things they needed to know when they get to the classroom, through performance assessments that see whether they can do certain things in practice. Those are sources of evidence, all of which can be corrupted if they're put into systems that are punitive or sanctions oriented, but which can be informative if they're in systems that are aimed at improvement, and that give more productive information, I think, than what we've tended to use over many, many years. Accreditation has been a paper process with thousands of pages of paper produced without much evidence about what people can actually do at the end of the program. And so people are beginning to rethink how those processes have gone on. Licensing processes used to be about chalking up credit hours, and passing basic skills tests and other multiple choice tests to get into or out of programs that don't have much relationship to whether you can teach. So we do need to be evolving the tools. Then we also have to be using them in ways that are productive.
Since you mentioned the word punitive, and in the context of figuring out the potential corrupting uses of different forms of assessment, evaluation, we don't have time in this short segment, but I want to just suggest, I'm sensing that in the report of the Academy that you guys are working on, there may be some very significant lessons, not just for the evaluation of teacher preparation, but for the uses of assessment data for other purposes and in other contexts. And I'm just hoping that we will see a day when some of what Linda has just been describing will become practice. That is, that we will find a sensible way to provide accountability information that doesn't interfere with program improvement, but that supports it, and vice versa. Ken, we have very little time left. Can I ask you, because this is clearly on people's minds, a two-part quick question. How much of this is now going to be made even more, not just relevant, but urgent in the wake of what we hope will be the end of the pandemic and thinking ahead? And to what extent can global cooperation and collaboration on these things really continue to be mutually beneficial for Americans and for our colleagues around the world? So that's a two-part question that you could spend the next 2 hours answering, but we're on limited time. So if you can try that, and then we're going to just do a quick wrap up.
With regard to the post-pandemic piece. The pandemic, in a lot of ways, has made more visible some of the inequities that currently exist within education systems, including teacher education systems. And and so I think it's sort of hopefully will provide some energy for investing in a way that will help us to address those. Our government here, for example, has made a decision for many years ago to invest in clinical medical education in teaching hospitals. Millions of dollars a year are put in to support the training sites, the teaching hospitals, and the mentoring that goes on in those hospitals in ways that teacher education hasn't had the advantage of. And so I think hopefully with greater visibility, I think there's widespread agreement of greater visibility of inequities that have existed, will be able to mobilize some support to work on those inequities. I've been in teacher education probably for 45 years, and always I've tried to learn from international colleagues about what they do. I think both Linda and I have spent a fair amount of time over many years trying to learn from international colleagues. We did a study a few years ago with a variety of others, where we studied education systems in teaching and teacher education that where there was agreement that they were highly successful, and tried to produce some thinking about those lessons in the US context. And so I think it's essential that we collaborate and learn from one another in ways that will make us all better at what we do.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I just want to say once again, I have been learning from Linda, and to some extent from you also, Ken, for years, but even just 40 minutes, I feel refreshed, restored, and optimistic that we may actually be able to make some progress on these issues that matter so much to us. I wonder if you'd want to just each wrap up with a minute's worth of what you think, if you were asked, what's the most important research priority if we want to infuse into these ongoing discussions evidence from practice and evidence from theory? What would you say should be our top, because we are, after all, the National Academy of Education to some extent, so we're interested in research and how it can improve education. What's your parting shot on that one?
All right, I'm unmuted, so I'll start and then give it to Linda. One of the big issues for me over the last 45 years has been sustainability of reforms that have existed. I've been part of several national projects, including the Holmes Group back in the 1980s, and have watched many projects produce wonderful practices in a few teacher education institutions around the country. And there have been efforts to scale those up by building in the Teachers for a New Era project as an example, a major $1 million or more, $100 million project in improving teacher preparation. You turn around a decade later and begin to look what happened to all that. And so I think we really need to figure out not just what these characteristics are that we need to aim for, and to get the resources in place to make it possible for us to achieve them, but how do we do these things in a way where they'll be sustained over time? And how do we do them in a way that will help prepare a teaching force of 3.6 million teachers? And the size of the teaching force, I think, is one of the factors that, and so I would like to see things, while I'm still around, I'd like to see some things stick and become the norm rather than producing change in a few institutions. So I think research about how to be able to do it in a way where it can be scaled up and sustained over time is my biggest issue, I think.
Linda, what's your advice to the research community wanting to contribute to the improvement of teacher preparation evaluation?
Well, Ken raised the issue of sustainability, which is ultimately a policy research question. It's a question of what are the policies that you put in place to embed practices in the way in which institutions function routinely, right? And Ken and I were part of a study on empowered educators, which was an international study, where we looked at some places that had really made reforms of teaching and teacher education much more sustainable. And I think one of the ways to figure that out is to look at countries that have embedded a way of doing the work that is funded, invested in, managed to be not a popcorn reform, not one thing that happens and goes away because we did a pilot project and then it evaporated, but is really rooted. Another way is to look at the ways in which some states in the United States and some in Australia and some in China and other places that have federalist systems do the same kind of work. And I think it is possible to do that. The other point I will make about a research priority is if we really want to tackle inequality for children, the experiences that children have that are really impeding them from being able to have, to realize their potential and to have the futures they deserve. We do need to continue to look at the preparation of teachers, the context within which they teach, and the investments that go to schools. It's always nice to say, is there one thing we could focus on? I think there are at least those three that we need to work on. But at the end of the day, we know that once you've got a resource base that's equitable, the next most important thing has to be the knowledge and skills of teachers and the dispositions and the commitments that they bring to that work. So while teacher education research has not been the sexiest area of research over all of these years, it is the most important in terms of what ultimately happens for children.
A great bit of inspiration, which will be followed by a great amount of perspiration. It's hard work, but I am ever so grateful to both of you for sharing your wisdom with us during this past 40 minutes, and wish you and the project continued success. And I guarantee there will be a lot of people very eager to see this in the US and around the world. And let's hope it builds toward a better future for all of us. Thank you both so very much.
Hello, everyone, again. Michael Feuer here from the George Washington University. You just had an opportunity to see the taped conversation that I had the great pleasure of moderating with Linda Darling-Hammond and Ken Zeichner. Let me start with a big thank you to our friends in the Forum for World Education for organizing this kind of an event, which I believe is so very necessary for the mutual reinforcement of what we're learning and lessons that can apply to our respective countries and regions around the world. A special hello to my GW colleagues and to my National Academy of Education colleagues. This part of our program now is an opportunity to hear from three distinguished experts, practitioners, scholars, people involved in teacher preparation at various levels. And let me just say that with, again, special thanks to Susan Sclafani for her wise kind of choreography of this panel. I think we're in for a quite interesting conversation now. Some of the topics that you have heard in the previous segment accountability and program improvement, the various problems of contextual variance within countries, within education systems, and of course across regions, the idea of sustainability of policy reforms and programmatic improvements, and of course the importance of continued global cooperation. So in the time we have now, I'm going to very gratefully turn to our discussants, and we will start with Ching, who is the Deputy Director General of Education in the Ministry of Education in Singapore, and at the same time is the Executive Director of the Academy of Singapore Teachers. Following from Chua's comments, we will go to Universität Hamburg and meet Ingrid Gogolin, who is a professor in intercultural and international comparative education. And then, since I'm here in the US, I figured just to be polite, we would have the American discussant as the third in our list. And of course, it's a great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director, President and CEO, sorry about that, of our American Association for Colleges of Teacher Education. So in advance, thank you. And we turn to Chua for opening remarks. And just be ready to unmute yourselves, please.
Good evening from outside, good morning from your side. I would just like to, before I start, I would like to thank Linda, Ken, and Michael for the sharing earlier on. And I would just like David to just help me to activate 2 slides to set the tone of the discussion, and then I'll proceed. Is David able to activate the slide for me? All right. If he's not able, then let me use the 2 slides as closing. Okay, so oh, he's trying to activate. All right. So I would just like to start by saying that if we want our students to be 21st century learners, we, our teachers, our educators need to be 21st century teachers and educators, right? And our professional development or teacher education must really develop our teachers that way. And I have a second slide. There's another slide. Now look at this. If we are always very reactive, you'll find that we'll always be behind the curve. So David, could you click this slide? Now it's the same letters, all right? But then you switch that we need to be creative. We always need to be proactive and stay ahead of the curve. If not, when we have a crisis that is very unexpected, we'll find that we are not really prepared and we'll be very stressed. Thanks, David. So I would like to say that while we are from different countries, but we actually have the same objective. We look into policy reform, programmatic improvement, and at the end of the day, it's really to improve the quality of our teachers, to build the capacity of our teachers, and ultimately our students will benefit. I think one of the biggest advantages for Singapore is that we are very small in size. We only have one National Institute of Education, that's NIE. And the director of NIE actually sits in our meetings with our minister, right? And for example, myself, I actually co-chair a number of committees with the NIE Dean for Academic and Strategic Development, as well as the Dean for the Office of Teacher Education. So we work very closely together. So I would like to say that the alignment with the 3 Ps, policy, preparation, and practice, need to be very aligned so that at the end of the day, we are on the same page. So, for example, since 3 years ago, our master teachers have started to co-design and co-deliver certain modules with our NIE professors at the pre-service level. There's a 48 hours of pedagogical practices. And because of this, we have a very close nexus between theory and practice. So our experienced teachers also attached to the institute or second seconded to there for a period of like maybe 3 years, and NIE professors also attached to our schools. So I think that is very important. And I would also like to say that for our country, MOE is deeply involved from the start. That is from teacher selection to recruitment to teacher preparation, which means that every student teachers with the Institute of Education is an employee of MOE, even at the initial teacher preparation stage. And they are paid a stipend, right, a salary. And the other thing about evaluation and accountability, which was actually mentioned by Linda and Ken, every year we will do a graduate preparedness survey for our beginning teachers who have graduated from NIE, let's say between 9 months to a year. And the survey also take into consideration of our stakeholders like our principals, HODs, and mentors. And the findings from the surveys will help NIE to review and make changes to their initial teacher preparation. And this is done yearly. So we need to have, we do have a very systematic professional development roadmap that moves from pre-service to in-service, because teaching is a craft. You need to constantly hone this craft. And when it comes to learning, you can never say that we have arrived. So I would also like to say that the COVID-19 has actually brought about a very big global crisis for us. And it has forced us to redesign the way we deliver our lesson, our pedagogical practices. And for us, I feel that at this point in time, we are looking at the future of learning. We tend it to the future of teaching and the future of the role of the teachers, the future of teachers' work, and ultimately the future of teachers' workload. So yeah, I would just like to pause here for the 5 minutes intro, and then later we could have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chua. Lots of very important insights, and I know we will get back to some of these issues as the conversation progresses. Professor Ingrid Gogolin.
Well, thank you very much. I had the pleasure to visit Singapore for for some occasions, and I can't tell you how much I envy your situation. But despite of that, let me at first thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you here and share some ideas with you. And thanks first for the very inspiring lecture we had the pleasure to listen to by Linda and Ken. I think that actually cooperation in this area is much more needed than we practice it. Although there is some cooperation going on in some countries, but it's more or less singular occasions when colleagues cooperate, but it's not very systematically carried out in, for example, international comparative education research to cooperate in the evaluation of teacher education. I particularly appreciate this point of view that we could much more profit from each other if we had some systematic international comparative research going on. This is because I feel that we share a large number of experiences and perspectives on the one hand, although we are so different on the other hand. So the problem, for example, the problem of increasing diversity in our education systems and how the teacher education system can deal with this is one of the problems I think we share, at least in very many parts of the world. But I don't see any joint efforts to kind of build on what we already know and develop things further. The example of Singapore could be very, very, very speaking to all of us, although diversity is a different problem there than it is in the north of Europe. But I must admit, I'm speaking from the perspective of the northern European countries. I saw in the chat that there was a colleague from Greece reporting a very different perspective. But with respect to teacher education in the Northern European countries, I think the situation in Finland is very, very similar to what we face in many other Northern European countries. But nevertheless, we have an urgent need to improve our systems because obviously they are not sufficient to solve the problems we face, especially with respect to the increasing diversity among our student populations. So one of the challenges we feel we have is to find out why the systems, although their structure is fairly good, it is fairly well organized. We don't have a problem of private investment into teacher education because it's state investment, etc., and it's in a certain sense more centralized, more structured than you showed us from in the US and many other parts of the world. But although this is the case, we face a lot of problems which are very similar to the ones we hear about in the United States. And I think there is one difference between the Finnish system and the rest of the European systems, which is in a certain sense very rarely thought about, and that is the difference of esteem that teacher education has in the society. Whereas in the Finnish society, well, teacher education has a very high esteem, and only the best go into teacher education. This is not at all the case in the rest of Europe. Teacher education in universities is very well established, but has no high esteem. And I was always thinking, how can we solve the problems if we don't also have at least kind of a look at this problem too? What can we do in order to raise the esteem in the society for teacher education? And that means also for education in general. A second problem I face is related to the improvement of evaluation systems. I think we have a lot of knowledge about what is missing in teacher education. I think we know most of the difficulties, etc., etc. But how can we improve? How can we build on that in order to get further? Also, with respect to the sustainability problem, which I deeply share, this is one of the big challenges also in the European context. And I think one of the solutions could be, what is also in Singapore in a way being done already, is to combine teacher qualification and school development. As far as I see it, in most of the European countries, teacher qualification is evaluated with respect to the initial phase of teacher education, and probably with a little kind of observations in the first phase of their being practitioners. But the development throughout the career as a professional is not being evaluated. And there is a group in European countries that try to combine school development with teacher education and evaluate the process rather than the outcomes at each stage. So one of the questions would be then, what can we expect from which stage of teacher education, and what can we not expect? And how can we improve the accompaniment of teacher education throughout a whole teacher career? So I'm deeply convinced that sustainability is in a certain sense also linked to this process of being a teacher from the beginning of education onwards. And at that point, I would like to hand over to Lynn, because I'm really eager to know what you think about these things.
Thank you, Ingrid. Perfect segue. Welcome now, Lynn Gangone from AACTE.
Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel with such wonderful colleagues. And also it was great to listen to Linda and Ken talk about the work at the National Academy. I wanted to share with everyone that actually AACTE is doing a landscape analysis for the National Academy study. And as such, I have some observations, if you will, about what's happening in the United States, both pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, that I hope will elicit some conversation between the three of us and certainly in the chat. As you know, we are a very decentralized system. We have 50 states, and each of those 50 states essentially do their own thing. We did this analysis, and I printed off the states and what their requirements are, how they evaluate their teacher education programs. Needless to say, I printed off about 140 pages, if you can imagine that, of how each state does its work inside of teacher education. And so while I very much, and I have been, and I've known my Singapore colleague and very much appreciate what they do there, I long for some of the uniformity that I know happens in Singapore, as well as the esteem with which the profession is viewed. One of the things that we have happening right now in the US, in addition to evaluating the evaluation of teacher education programs, is because of the deep shortage, what we have across our 50 states, and I actually checked with my colleague from the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification, nearly every single state has ramped up what we call emergency certifications or long-term substitute teachers. And this is a severe issue, not only because we are putting teachers in the classroom in the US who don't have the pedagogical or content expertise, but what's happening also is that these are the teachers, and I use that term in quotes, that end up in our neediest districts. And so the issue of equity that Linda certainly addressed and that AACTE is working very hard to address as well is even beyond evaluating the evaluation of teacher preparation. I mean, we have a really big problem here in terms of who is going into the classroom. So what I thought I would do is just to highlight, if you will, 5 or 6 areas from the US perspective. I always find it interesting to speak for the entire country, but bear with me as I try to give you some perspective on what we're looking at right now as we think about what Linda said at the end of her talk and what Ken alluded to as well, right? How do we turn this into opportunity and policy? So the first thing that's happened in the US is that there is a significant teacher shortage and few individuals are interested in teaching. And I just want to point out a statistic to you that even pre-pandemic in 2018, when we published a study of colleges of education around the US, every single major across the US was increasing, but education had decreased by 19%. That was pre-pandemic. So that gives you a sense of where we are in terms of being able to recruit teachers into the profession. There have been things that have happened during the pandemic, of course, that have further discouraged entry into teaching. Watching how teachers have managed the pandemic in the US, whether schools are opened or closed, what kind of responsibilities teachers had, and how they had to ensure safety in their classrooms. That's been a challenge. The second is that there's little or no incentive to become a teacher. And I think both Linda and Ken really address this. Where are the resources to both support colleges of education and programs of teacher education, as well as where are the resources to support students? So for example, right now, one of the things that AACTE is doing is we'll be introducing legislation in collaboration with our state college and university association and an institution in the US, University of Northern Iowa, that looks at how we increase the financial aid that teacher candidates would receive, what we do to help support them, because what we found in another study that we did in terms of how education students pay for their education is that there are distinct differences between how white students pay for their education, how African American students pay for their education, and how our Latinx students pay for their education. Some of that is about how to manage debt. Some of that is time to degree if students don't want to have to manage a lot of debt. So unlike other systems, right, we depend on the individual to pay their tuition. And in the US, that makes it very, very hard. Also, because of the 50 states and the differences, it also makes it hard once you become a teacher to have mobility, right, across the country. NASDAQ, the organization that I spoke about earlier, is actually working with a government organization to look at how do we increase teacher reciprocity. So that's number 2, is little or no incentive. Number 3 is inequities have been exacerbated by the global pandemic. We've talked about this, lack of broadband and equipment access. You know, I looked at 2 articles in our New York Times. One was the digital divide starts with the laptop shortage, and noted that the districts with deep pockets went out. And another about our college students, no home, no Wi-Fi, pandemic adds strain to the poor college students. So we have exacerbation of inequities. We have students unable to access the technology that's necessary. We have not prepared our teaching force to teach online. And so it's no surprise that when we had to quickly move to this, it was a challenge. And so looking at policy ahead, one of the things we need to talk about, I think this is throughout all of our countries, is how do we talk about what it means to teach online, and how do we ensure that that online teaching is robust and is appropriate? We will continue to see shortages in mathematics and science. I would predict that we would have to continue to teach online in those areas to reach rural districts, to reach other folks who can't have that qualified math and science teacher in their classroom. Number 4 would be something that Ken and Linda talked about as well, and my colleagues talked about. How do we diversify the teaching profession, and how do we find more teachers in what we call these critical shortage areas of mathematics, science, English as a second language? I noticed one of the questions in the chat had to do with the teaching of foreign languages. That's a dearth here in the US. Number 5 would be there are insufficient resources for colleges of education, but also for us in the United States, there are a shrinking number of institutions that are actually offering teacher education. So let me share with you that right now, 1/3 of our university-based programs in the US are granting only 30 bachelor's and master's degrees or less. And so we have a third of our providers, if you will, in very, very, very small and very thinly resourced programs. This is a real issue for us, and we have to figure out how it is that we are going to help these institutions, because we know that with the teacher shortage, we need everyone to be preparing high qualified teachers. And then the final thing I'll say is, I ask a question, which is number 6, does one teacher in one classroom work anymore? And will online learning end with the end of the pandemic? There's some very interesting work happening out of Arizona State University, which is an AACTE member institution, and they actually have worked with the Education Commission on Sustainable Development Goal 4 to look at transforming the education workforce and developing learning teams. So again, this becomes a policy issue in terms of how we look at teacher education in the United States. And finally, I will just close by saying, how is it that we wouldn't allow a medical doctor in the United States to have such haphazard criteria, such haphazard training and certification? Why is it that in looking at evaluation of teacher preparation, but also looking at the broader scope, why is it that we allow uncertified, unlicensed, and unprepared individuals into our classroom? So, you know, that's a very brief look into the US perspective. We have many challenges, but I also believe we have many opportunities. So thank you for allowing me to share those thoughts. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you ever so much, Lynn. I'm reminded when I hear the description of the variance and the inequalities and the diffusion of responsibility across the American landscape of education, of what a former president of Harvard once said, that we don't really have an education system here, we have an education chaos. And in some ways, he also said that we kind of like it that way. I'm not so sure of that anymore, but certainly we are dealing with a great amount of variability. I'd like to get to that point with respect to the evaluation question. And let me start with you, CHUA. In a place such as Singapore, where there is more centralized control over much of what relates to education, what would you say is the attitude toward the evaluation of the way you in Singapore are going about preparing future teachers? Is there an atmosphere of a kind of demand for evaluative evidence about the teacher preparation system?
Yeah, thank you. I would maybe like to start off by saying that, for us, way back here, when we select teachers, we actually project our manpower planning and projection, let's say 5 to 6 years ahead. So even at the selection stage, we will actually know roughly which subject, what level of teachers that we need. So, the demand to join the teaching profession is very high, and we are very stringent. We are able to attract the top 1/3 cohort of our university education. It doesn't mean that just because your results are good, you will have the right disposition. So what we have done is that after we have selected them, they will go through an interview. When they cleared that interview, they will be sent to a school for 6 months to do this thing called the teaching practice. Now, during these 6 months, it's a time for them to ask themselves, is teaching for me? And it's also for the schools to look at them, is teaching for them? So you can have stellar result, but you may not have the disposition of a teacher. That's fine, right? Before you step into NIE, because the moment you step into the National Institute of Education, that is where the clock starts ticking. And that is, they are paid to do their teacher education, the initial teacher preparation in NIE. And they need to clear and pass, of course. And after that, they will be sent to a school. So there's no such a thing as when I graduate, I have no school to go to, because every student teacher I mentioned that they are already an employee of MOE. So they'll be sent to the school, and because they are being paid, right? So they have to work for us for at least 3 years. All right. And that is a bond they need to, and it's something that everyone knows about it. So it is very strict. And the thing is that when they are in school, as a beginning teachers, they are being mentored by experienced teacher for a period of 2 years. And we in the academy will provide the support to the mentors for 2 years. All right. So they have our support, and we have started to map. We have this thing called the Skills Future for Educators. So we have started to map our teacher professional development from 4 levels of practice. So when they're in teacher education, that will be the emergent level. That means after they've completed teacher education and sent to school, they're at the emergent level. And the in-service training will kick off to help them to move on from the emergent to proficient to accomplished and leading. So that is a systematic a level for them, and there's a systematic roadmap. And our evaluation for teacher education in NIE, I've mentioned, is the graduate survey from our stakeholders as well as from our beginning teachers. I just give you an example. For example, when we evaluated the teacher education, many of the beginning teachers felt that they do not have enough teaching practice. When they get to school, they are in the practicum and they are being assessed. So we have looked at the various feedback. And since 3 years ago, we have actually made changes for our initial teacher preparation from 12 months to 16 months. And we added a 1 month teaching assistantship in addition to the practicum. So we make changes along the way, because at the end of the day, the true test will be a student teacher stepping out of teacher college into school and say that I'm ready, all right, to actually start to teach. Of course, they are very new, they are novice, they have to be guided. And in the school timetable, a beginning teacher must have this at least 1.5 hours a week coincide with the experienced teacher, so that we create time for mentoring. So we do have at certain milestone surveys to actually also give us a sense of how our beginning teachers are, are they adjusting well? And then from there, we will make changes to our in-service as well as our pre-service. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Well, it's
your satisfaction.
It's a very important set of information, CHUA. I want to thank you for that. And going back to one of Ingrid's points earlier, that coming from a place such as Germany with the Lander system and with a certain amount of diffused responsibility and perhaps some of the incoherence in the system that emerges because of that, you said, Ingrid, that in some ways you envy what you know about what's going on in Singapore. And I want to pick up on that, that theme and ask both you and Lynn, knowing what we do from international comparative education, that it is a little bit naive to just assume that we can import wholesale systems from one country to our own country. On the other hand, if you had to pick out one or two examples from what CHUA has just laid out that you would most want your colleagues in Germany, and then Lynn, you can say this on behalf of 330 million Americans, which would be fine. What would the nuggets that you would most like to import to your systems from what you've heard about the way it is managed in Singapore?
Well, one thing I would like to import is this stepwise process, which CHUA just told us about. So as I said, in Germany, we evaluate step 1 and step 2. One is the step at the university. Step 2 is a kind of internship, which lasts about 1.5 years, which is fairly much. But then the evaluation ends, and I think the process of being a teacher has very, very much to do today, given that the situation we live in. Lynn referred to the online problem which we have now. Given that situation is changing every day severely with respect to the students we have to teach, etc., etc. I think we have to put more effort in the career and also more effort in evaluation of the steps forward a teacher can make. And I would really appreciate if that could be done in Germany. On the other hand, we have very many advantages which are very similar to what CHUA said. For example, our students don't pay any fees, so they are supported just like every other student. So that is not the problem. It's not the problem of wages. Teachers are paid very well, and they are paid in the same level in all the 16 lenders. So that is not the problem. The problem is elsewhere, and it is kind of, for us, it's kind of deeper in the structure. And I'm thinking about how can we get into this deeper structure bit. I think the processing of being a teacher, this is one of the points of action I would love to see.
Lynn?
Oh, Michael, I don't know if I can limit myself to one thing. I mean,
well, I'm going to limit you to just two things because we're running short of time.
Great.
So pick out the two best ones then.
Two things would be resource support, both for the programs and for the students. Ingrid, just talked about money isn't the issue. Great. I would love to see that. And the second thing would be what I would truly love to see is some capacity for the 50 states to gain some level of uniformity. I respect the context, and I know that each state is different, but there has to be a way that we create some kind of system where there's agreement and reciprocity so that we can together elevate the teaching profession and not place our candidates at risk for trying to figure out which state they can certify or license in, et cetera. It just would help for us to agree on what does it mean to be a classroom ready teacher.
That's fascinating. And I think one of the themes that emerges from this conversation so far is the struggle for a coherent system of evaluation within different contexts of societies that have chosen or not chosen to have education systems that are, by definition, by structure, by governance, so varied. And this tension between some uniformity and some of the creative capacity that comes from differentiation, I think that's going to be with us for a while. I want to ask, because we're so eager to see a continuation of international cooperation on these issues, one of you, I believe, mentioned international comparative assessment. And there you have an interesting example of where some of the results of international comparative assessment promote more competition and less cooperation. And it would be interesting to hear from you about what would you advise, for example, the Forum for World Education and other such organizations to promote a real spirit of global collaboration and cooperation that would be of mutual benefit, and to get away a little bit from, you know, what all of us have suffered, which is one form or another of the so-called PISA shock, when we see ourselves ranked in very competitive looking tables. Would any of you care to comment on what you would like to see happen next in terms of international cooperation? I'm afraid after that, we're going to be out of time. And although I could spend the rest of the day and the week talking to you about this, I know many of our viewers and colleagues probably have to get back to doing other things as well. So if you can just try to wrap up with that vision of collaboration, I think that would be of great value, at least to the continuation of this sort of effort.
Michael, I just want to jump in and say one of the things I really appreciated about Linda and Ken's comments is they talked about moving away from punitive evaluation to really continuous improvement. And I would love to work with other countries to see how they do what I would call value-added evaluation, so that we're not punishing institutions. We're saying, here are some gaps and here's how you can improve, and here are examples from other countries where they've been able to do that. I would like to see that from a collaborative perspective.
Thank you, Lynn. Ingrid?
I would fully agree to that. We have some experience in the World Education Research Association, which I had the pleasure of being the past president. And there we try to do just this, try to have evaluations, cooperation in evaluations, which intend to be supportive, and that's what I referred to when I started, to be supported with respect to development, not that much supportive with respect to competition. And I really appreciate that we're going on that line, and it's great that now we could also exchange on that. And I thank you once again for making me part of this.
CHUA, some parting thoughts perhaps about how we can continue this conversation.
All right, I think when it comes to education, we need to have this spirit of abundance mentality. All right, in the sense that we are all in the same, we have all the same mission. You mentioned about PISA. I would like to say that while our students have done very well, it's never our objective to be number one or number two. Even our minister said that it's okay, even if the ranking drops. That is not our priority. Our main priority is to have our PISA data to be a source of reference, especially in the areas of the 21st century competencies, like, for example, collaborative learning, problem solving, maybe global awareness, because these are skills that are very difficult to assess. And well, if somebody in the OECD is able to help us to give us a good reference, I mean, that would be very useful, because we don't want to spend our life measuring something that's so difficult to measure, but yet it's important to impart for our students, and we are happy to share. I would also like to say that for us, at the end of the day, this pandemic has taught us a lot of things. It has taught us that technology has moved from being a digital disruptor to a digital deliverer, and technology has enabled our students to continue learning even during the pandemic, where we are not able to have it face-to-face. And what is more important, that it has helped our teachers to relook at their own pedagogical practices, because online lesson require a different skill set as compared to face-to-face lesson. But what is more important is that while technology strives to build first-class robots, we as educators must continue to strive to develop first-class humans. All right, at the end, it's not just about knowledge, skills, and values. It's also about teaching our teachers as well as our students flexibility, wisdom, and empathy, and strive to move into a very unpredictable future. And it has gone beyond just knowledge and skills. So I would like to say that researchers have actually said that technology is not the main thing. The main thing is actually our teachers. I would like to just end off by showing you this object lesson, that we would like to be always ahead, because when we encounter a pandemic, it'll be like this, we'll be at a loss. All right, but if we work together, we find that it is not so bad, and in time to come, we find that our teachers can really thrive. So this is indeed something that we all would want to as educators, and if we can work together and learn from one another, I think the synergy and the impact can be very explosive. Yeah,
So I just
thanks.
want to thank you again, and note that you mentioned flexibility, wisdom, and empathy.
And empathy, yes.
And it's very lovely that the initials are FWE, which is exactly what the Forum for World
Yes.
Education, I believe, is actually all about. I want to say special thank you again to my dear colleague, Lynn Goodwin from Teachers College and from the University of Hong Kong, Susan Sclafani, Becca Maynard, others who organized this and took the risk of inviting me to try to be a moderator. This has been a most stimulating several hours, and we've learned a lot. I want to thank all of our participants and attendees. I know that there were lots of interesting questions and comments in the chat. I wish we had time to take them all on. I hope you will, through the wonders of Zoom technology, be able to continue linking with one another, even outside the chat once we close off this webinar. Thank you to David for helping with all the technology, and to my colleagues at GW for helping me with this. I think on that happy note, I am delighted to once again wish you all good health, success, and my deepest hope is that we will meet the old-fashioned way somewhere before too long.
That would
Stay
be
well, and
lovely.
thank you so much to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.